At 12:40 in the afternoon on January 15, 1919, a 38-year-old firefighter named George Leahy was standing in the doorway of Engine 31's firehouse on Commercial Street in Boston. He had just finished a game of cards with his colleagues. Behind him, the men were eating lunch. The temperature outside had risen to a pleasant 40 degrees after days of bitter cold. Through the doorway, Leahy could see a 50-foot steel tank across the street, a tank that held 2.3 million gallons of industrial molasses. He had watched that tank for 3 years. He had heard it groan. He had seen it leak, and in the next 4 seconds, George Leahy would watch it kill him. The rivets began popping off the tank like machine gun fire. The ground shook, a low, thunderous rumble. Witnesses said it sounded like an elevated train approaching, built into a roar. The entire side of the tank peeled away, and 26 million pounds of molasses exploded outward in a wave 25 feet high, moving at 35 miles per hour directly toward George Leahy and everything he loved. He had time to yell one word to the men behind him. "Run!" The firehouse was knocked clean off its foundation. George Leahy was pinned beneath a beam as molasses flooded the collapsed building. He kept his head twisted above the rising tide for as long as his strength held. It held for 2 hours. And then George Leahy drowned in sugar while his fellow firefighters tried to cut through the wreckage to reach him. 2.3 million gallons, 35 miles per hour, 21 dead, 150 injured, the largest civil lawsuit in Massachusetts history, and the man responsible, the man who built that tank without an engineer, without proper testing, without a single qualified opinion, had been promised a promotion if he finished on time. He finished on time. Was this the price of American progress? Or was it murder, dressed in the language of commerce? The story begins not with molasses, not with Boston, not with Arthur Gell or the North End or any of the specific elements that would combine to kill 21 people on that January afternoon. The story begins with sugarcane waving in Caribbean winds, with the brutal economics of sweetness, and with a chemical process that would transform American industry and American warfare in ways that nobody in 1915 fully understood. To understand how 21 people came to drown in molasses on a winter afternoon in Boston, you have to understand what molasses meant to America in 1915. It wasn't just for gingerbread cookies and baked beans. Molasses was money. Molasses was power. And when the guns started firing in Europe in August of 1914, molasses became war itself. The thick, dark syrup, a byproduct of sugar refining shipped from Caribbean plantations, could be fermented into ethanol. And ethanol was the active ingredient in industrial alcohol, which was essential for manufacturing smokeless powder, dynamite, and the endless varieties of explosives that modern warfare required. When the Great War began consuming munitions faster than anyone had imagined possible, the companies that could supply industrial alcohol suddenly found themselves swimming in profits as thick and dark as molasses itself. Sugar had made fortunes since Columbus brought cane cuttings to the West Indies in the late 1400s. The so-called triangle trade of the 17th and 18th centuries had moved molasses from Caribbean plantations to New England distilleries, where it became rum, which was traded to Africa for slaves, who were shipped to the Caribbean to grow more sugarcane. Even after abolition ended the slave trade, the Caribbean sugar industry continued to pour its thick, dark byproduct into the holds of steamers bound for American ports. By the early 20th century, molasses had become essential to industries far beyond rum production. The fermentation of molasses into ethanol produced industrial alcohol used in manufacturing everything from perfume to photographic chemicals to pharmaceutical compounds. At scale, this was an enormously profitable business. Then the war came. In August 1914, the German Empire invaded Belgium, and the chain reaction of alliances pulled Europe into the most destructive conflict in human history. The Great War consumed men and material at a rate that shocked military planners on all sides. Industrial alcohol was essential to this production. Smokeless powder, which had replaced black powder in modern firearms, required alcohol in its manufacture. The British and French, their industrial capacity stretched to breaking point, began placing massive orders with American suppliers. Companies like DuPont and Hercules Powder saw their profits explode. They had orders for all the explosives they could produce, and to produce those explosives, they needed industrial alcohol. And to produce industrial alcohol, they needed molasses. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, known as USIA, was one of the largest alcohol distillers in the nation. Through its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, USIA operated a plant in East Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Caribbean molasses was transformed into industrial-grade alcohol. But USIA had a problem. They were buying molasses from a third party whose storage tank sat across town in South Boston. Every middleman took a cut. Every transfer cost money. Every delay cost opportunity. The solution was obvious. Build their own tank. Build it big. Build it on the Boston waterfront where ships could pump molasses directly from their holds into storage. Build it close to the rail lines that connected to the Cambridge distillery. Build it fast enough to catch the next shipment from Cuba. The man USIA chose to make this happen was named Arthur P. Gell. Arthur Gell was 36 years old in late 1914 when USIA President Frederick M. Harrison handed him the tank project. He had been with Purity Distilling since 1909, working his way up from secretary to treasurer. He was an accountant, a paper pusher, a man who understood invoices and ledgers and the delicate arithmetic of corporate ambition. What he did not understand, what he had never studied, never practiced, never encountered in any professional capacity, was engineering. He couldn't read a blueprint. He didn't know the tensile strength of steel. He had no idea how to calculate the stress that 26 million pounds of liquid would place on a cylindrical tank wall. But Arthur Gell understood one thing with crystal clarity. His career depended on building this tank and building it fast. Gell had started his working life at age 14 as an office boy with Hiram Walker and Sons, the Canadian distillers famous for their whiskey. From that humble beginning, he had climbed the corporate ladder through clerical and administrative positions, always proving himself useful, always meeting his deadlines, always doing what his superiors asked without creating problems. This was precisely why he was the wrong man for the tank project. What USI needed was someone who understood structural engineering, who could evaluate contractor proposals, who would recognize when specifications were inadequate or materials were substandard. Harrison and USIA Vice President Nelson B. Mayer had dangled a promotion in front of Gell, a vice presidency at the parent company in New York. The implication was explicit. Succeed with this project, and your future was secured. Fail, and your future with USIA was over. The deadline was December 31st, 1950. A ship carrying 700,000 gallons of molasses from Cuba was scheduled to arrive on New Year's Eve. If the tank wasn't ready to receive that shipment, the molasses would have to be dumped at sea or rerouted to another facility at massive cost. Gell contacted Hammond Iron Works, a company that specialized in steel railway tanks, to design and build the structure. They delivered blueprints in April 1915 with a price tag of $30,000. The tank would be enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, 240 feet in circumference, capable of holding 2.3 million gallons. To put that in perspective, you could fill 3.5 Olympic swimming pools with that much liquid. But Gell's problems were just beginning. The land he needed for the tank belonged to the Boston Elevated Railway Company, and the negotiations dragged on for months. By September, Gell had finally signed a 20-year lease for the 17,000-square-foot waterfront parcel at 529 Commercial Street. Construction could begin November the 1st. He had exactly 60 days to build the largest storage tank in New England. The parcel sat wedged between the inner harbor and a densely packed residential neighborhood called the North End. And the people who lived there, the people who would have to live in the shadow of Gell's monument to corporate ambition, had no say in the matter at all. The North End of Boston in 1915 was one of the most crowded places in America. Into an area less than a square mile were packed more than 40,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them Italian immigrants who had fled poverty in Sicily, Calabria, Campania, and Naples in search of something better in the New World. The neighborhood had been declining for decades. The wealthy colonial families who once built mansions overlooking the harbor had long since departed for Beacon Hill and the suburbs. The Irish had come during the potato famine, filling the old mansions turned tenements. The Jews arrived next, establishing synagogues and Hebrew schools along Salem Street. And then, beginning in the 1880s, the Italians. They came from the agrarian south of Italy, fleeing grinding poverty, limited opportunity, and the rigid social hierarchies of a country that had only unified as a nation in 1861. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians immigrated to America. Most were poor, most were illiterate, most spoke little or no English. By 1915, they dominated the North End. Street signs bore Italian names. Shops sold olive oil and dried pasta. The Sacred Heart Church in North Square offered masses in Italian. The neighborhood had one of the highest population densities in the world, with families crowded into tenements that had been built for a fraction of their current occupancy. Children collected molasses that leaked from storage tanks and brought it home to their mothers. Vendors pushed carts through the narrow streets selling fruit and vegetables. The North End was loud, cramped, and desperately poor. And to the men who ran companies like USIA, it was the perfect place to build something dangerous. The reasoning was simple. Poor immigrants, many of them not yet citizens, many of them unable to speak English, had no political power. They couldn't vote. They couldn't organize effective opposition. They couldn't afford lawyers. Land in the North End was cheap. Resistance would be minimal. The prejudice against Italian immigrants was explicit and widespread. President Theodore Roosevelt had once described Southern Italians as the most fecund and least desirable population of Europe. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts advocated for literacy tests specifically designed to reduce Italian immigration. The Italians of the North End lived with this prejudice daily. In the jobs they couldn't get, the neighborhoods they couldn't live in, the opportunities that remained closed to them no matter how hard they worked. The site USIA selected sat at the corner of Commercial Street and the harbor, directly across from the Engine 31 firehouse, within yards of the North End paving yard, where city workers loaded and unloaded wagons, and beneath the elevated railway tracks that carried commuter trains through the neighborhood. Charter Street, where many Italian families lived in cramped tenements, was barely a stone's throw away. Arthur Gell got his lease. Construction began, and the people of the North End watched a metal monster rise on their waterfront. By early December 1915, Hammond Iron Works had 30 men working day and night on the tank. Electric lights had been installed so crews could continue through the darkness. Gell had promised to pay any additional expenses required to meet the December 31st deadline. The steel plates arrived by rail, 7 horizontal rings of them, each overlapping the ring below and secured by thousands of rivets. The construction site itself presented challenges that should have raised red flags. The ground was unstable, waterfront fill that had been added to extend Commercial Street into the harbor decades earlier. Building a massive steel tank weighing hundreds of tons on such uncertain footing required careful foundation work. But there was no time for careful. The concrete base was poured quickly, without adequate curing time, without the soil testing that proper engineering would have demanded. The work proceeded with alarming haste. Riveters worked in shifts, their pneumatic hammers creating a constant din that echoed through the North End. Each steel plate had to be positioned precisely, its holes aligning with the ring below, so that rivets could be driven through both layers to create a watertight seal. This was delicate work that required skill and patience. What it got was speed. The riveting process itself was an art. A rivet team typically consisted of 4 men: the heater, who brought the rivet to red-hot temperature, the catcher, who positioned it in the hole, the bucker-up, who held a heavy dolly bar against the manufactured head, and the driver, who used a pneumatic hammer to form a new head on the other side, squeezing the rivet tight and creating the seal. Done properly, with rivets of the correct size and material, this process created joints as strong as the plates themselves. Done hastily, with undersized rivets and inadequate attention to detail, it created points of weakness that would propagate into catastrophic failure. The construction of a tank this size required careful engineering. The bottom ring would bear the full weight of 26 million pounds of liquid, pressing outward and downward. Each successive ring could be slightly thinner because it bore progressively less stress. Tank engineering in 1915 was not an exact science by modern standards, but it was a well-established craft. Boston's building codes specified acceptable stress levels for steel structures. The accepted factor of safety, the margin between design capacity and theoretical failure point, was typically 4 for static load applications. The physics were straightforward. Liquid in a cylindrical tank exerts pressure in all directions, downward from gravity and outward from the weight of the liquid above pressing down. The pressure at any given depth is determined by the height of liquid above that point. At the bottom of a 50-foot tank filled with molasses, the pressure would be enormous. The steel walls had to be thick enough and strong enough to resist this outward force without deforming or rupturing. Engineers in 1915 had formulas for calculating these stresses. They understood that the circumferential stress, the tendency of the cylindrical wall to split open like a barrel with a weak stave, was the critical factor. They knew that riveted joints were weaker than solid plate. So the overlap between plates and the number and placement of rivets had to be calculated to ensure the joint could bear the load. They knew that steel became brittle in cold weather, losing its ability to deform gradually and failing instead with sudden, catastrophic cracks. Arthur Gell knew none of this, and he didn't hire anyone who did. Arthur Gell had specified a factor of safety of 3 when he ordered the tank from Hammond. When asked later where this number came from, he said vaguely that he had been told in the past by tank manufacturers that they built tanks with a factor of safety of 2. So I figured 3 would be sufficient. He didn't know who had told him this. He didn't know what size tanks they were discussing. He didn't understand that a 2.3 million-gallon tank holding molasses, which is 40% denser than water, presented entirely different engineering challenges. But even as the hammers rang and the rivets were set, The steel plates that Hammond delivered were not the thickness specified in the blueprints. The bottom ring was only 0.667 inches thick instead of the required 0.687 inches. Every other ring was similarly underbuilt, 5 to 10% thinner than the plans called for. The steel itself had another problem. It contained too little manganese, a chemical element that provides flexibility and resistance to cracking. Without adequate manganese, the steel became brittle, especially in cold temperatures. The transition temperature, the point at which steel shifts from flexible behavior to brittle behavior, for the molasses tank steel was estimated by later analysis to be around 59 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly higher than typical Boston winter temperatures. It was similar to the flawed steel used in the hull of the RMS Titanic, which had sunk just 3 years earlier, in part because cold North Atlantic water had made its steel brittle and prone to fracture. Arthur Gell didn't know any of this. He didn't have the technical training to recognize substandard materials. He didn't hire anyone who did. When the steel arrived from Hammond, no engineer inspected it. No metallurgist tested it. No one outside Hammond's own employees examined the quality and fitness of the steel which was delivered or the method of construction, as Gell would later admit under oath. The rivets themselves were also problematic. The rivets on the molasses tank were undersized for the loads they would bear. The holes drilled for them created stress concentration points where cracks would eventually form. The installation was rushed, with workers hurrying to meet Gell's deadline, rather than ensuring each rivet was properly set. The contract with Hammond called for a water test after construction was complete, filling the tank completely to check for leaks and structural integrity. This was standard practice. Water testing would reveal structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic. Gell skipped it. Instead, on the day before the deadline, he ordered workers to put 6 inches of water in the bottom of the tank and call it good enough. 6 inches in a 50-foot tank. Just enough to cover the bottom. Not nearly enough to reveal the structural deficiencies that would kill 21 people 3 years later. On December 29, 1915, Hammond Iron Works sent Gell a letter along with their final invoice. In order to include it in this year's business, they wrote, and even if the tank is not, technically speaking, completely finished by December 31st, we trust it will be satisfactory that our invoice is rendered under this date. The next morning, the steamer from Cuba arrived in Boston Harbor. Workers pumped 700,000 gallons of molasses into Arthur Gell's tank, filling it to a depth of about 13 feet. The deadline had been met. Gell's promotion was secure, and the north end had acquired a neighbor that would groan, leak, and crack for the next 3 years. The problems began immediately. The very first day the tank was filled, an employee noticed molasses bleeding through the joints between the steel plates. He reported it to his supervisors. They reported it to Arthur Gell. Gell dismissed the concern. The leaking continued. Puddles of molasses formed at the base of the tank. The children of Charter Street and the surrounding blocks discovered that free molasses was available for anyone willing to scrape it off the ground or catch it as it dripped from the seams. They came with pails and jars, collecting the sticky syrup to bring home to their families. Some made their own candy from the leakage. The tank had become a neighborhood fixture, ugly, loud, and useful in its own accidental way. The visible leaking was embarrassing for USIA. Commercial Street was a busy thoroughfare. The elevated railway ran directly past the tank, giving commuters a daily view of its stained and dripping exterior. The Boston Elevated Railway Company complained about the mess spreading onto their property and tracks. City inspectors made periodic visits, but beyond visual embarrassment and minor cleanup costs, USIA saw no reason for alarm. The tank was doing its job. Molasses was going in. Molasses was going out to the distillery. A little leakage was, in their view, the cost of doing business. But the tank did more than leak. It groaned. Every time fresh molasses was pumped in, the structure emitted deep, unsettling sounds that echoed through the neighborhood. The metal plates expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The rivets strained against the cyclic loading of filling and emptying. Workers who climbed inside to clean the interior reported finding loose flakes of steel that had fallen from the walls, physical evidence that the tank was deteriorating from the inside. The groaning was particularly pronounced during the winter months when temperature differentials were greatest. Warm molasses from the Caribbean, pumped into a tank that had been standing in freezing Boston air, created thermal stresses that the already inadequate steel struggled to accommodate. The tank would creak and moan like a living thing in pain. Residents of the North End grew accustomed to the sound, the way people who live near airports learn to sleep through the roar of jet engines. But familiarity didn't mean safety. One employee, Isaac Gonzalez, tried repeatedly to warn his supervisors about the condition of the tank. He had been with the company since before the tank was built. He understood what he was seeing. The flakes of steel, the visible rust, the groaning and vibrating. These were symptoms of structural fatigue. Metal doesn't last forever under cyclic stress. Every time the tank was filled and emptied, every time it expanded with warm molasses and contracted in cold air, microscopic cracks propagated through the steel. Over time, these cracks would grow, weaken the structure, and lead to catastrophic failure. Gonzalez reported his concerns through proper channels. He was ignored. Another worker collected chunks of steel that had sheared off and presented them to USIA executives as evidence of danger. The pieces were substantial, not dust or scale, but fragments of the tank's structural metal. He showed them the rust eating through from the inside, where molasses had found its way between overlapping plates. He explained that the rivets were loosening, that the seams were opening, that the tank was failing. The executives reported response, "The tank still stands." That phrase captured the essence of USIA's approach to safety. As long as catastrophic failure hadn't occurred, the company saw no reason to spend money on repairs or improvements. The tank was leaking, but it was holding. The tank was groaning, but it was functioning. Workers were concerned, but workers were always concerned about something. The only metric that mattered was whether molasses was flowing from the ships to the distillery. By that measure, the tank was a success. The company maintained records of the tank's operations, dates when shipments arrived, volumes pumped, temperatures recorded. These documents would later prove crucial in the lawsuit. They showed that the tank had been filled to capacity only 7 times before the final, fatal filling in January 1919. Each time it was filled, new stress was placed on already weakened steel. Each cycle of loading and unloading created more fatigue cracks. The tank was literally tearing itself apart, one rivet at a time, one microscopic crack at a time, over the course of 3 years. Between fillings, maintenance workers would enter the tank to clean out residue and inspect the interior. Their reports, when they bothered to file them, told a consistent story: rust, deterioration, loose metal, concerning sounds and movements. Some workers refused to enter the tank, fearing it would collapse while they were inside. Others went in reluctantly, working quickly and getting out as soon as possible. No one wanted to be inside when the inevitable happened. The company's solution to the visible leaking was not repair, but concealment. In 1918, Gel ordered the tank painted brown to match the color of the molasses staining its sides. The leaks continued, but now they were less obvious. The caulking was touched up periodically. Workers would slap additional sealant over the weeping seams, a temporary fix that addressed symptoms rather than causes. Frances Brown, a clerk for the Bay State Railway, whose office window looked directly at the tank, later testified about what she had observed over the years. Several times that molasses flowed down the sides of the tank. From her window, the evidence of the tank's deterioration was visible every day. Meanwhile, the war that had created the demand for industrial alcohol was creating something else: fear. Anarchists, many of them Italian, had begun a campaign of bombings across America. In 1917, a massive explosion at the Aetna Chemical Company plant in Pennsylvania, attributed to anarchists, killed 116 people. Police departments across the country were on high alert for anarchist activity. Arthur Gell took these threats seriously. He hired guards and had them sworn in as special Boston police officers. A policeman was stationed at the Commercial Street tank around the clock. The company was far more worried about bombs than about structural failure. The possibility that the tank might simply collapse, that the steel itself was the danger, apparently never occurred to Gell or his superiors. Just days before the disaster, on January 10, 1919, Gell received a telephone call from the Boston Police Department. They had received threats from an Italian anarchist group, angry about recently passed immigration legislation. The Commercial Street tank had been mentioned as a potential target. Gell doubled the guard detail. He alerted his supervisors. He documented the warning. But he did nothing about the groaning, leaking, deteriorating tank that had been sending distress signals for 3 years. The danger to the tank wasn't coming from outside. It was built into the steel itself. The war ended on November 11, 1918. The armistice brought celebrations across America and Europe. But for companies like USIA, the end of fighting brought a different concern. The end of government contracts for industrial alcohol meant declining profits. Fortunately, a new market was about to open. Prohibition was coming. The 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, was working its way through state legislatures toward ratification. Nebraska would become the decisive 36th state to approve it on January 16, 1919, one day after the molasses flood. The amendment would take effect 1 year later. For distillers like USIA, This created both a threat and an opportunity. Molasses could be fermented into rum as easily as it could be converted to industrial alcohol. USIA had every incentive to process as much molasses as quickly as possible before January 1920. On January 13, 1919, 2 days before the disaster, the steamer Miliero arrived from Cuba carrying 600,000 gallons of fresh molasses. Workers pumped it through the 220-foot underground pipe into the tank over the next 24 hours. The captain of the Miliero testified later that as his ship sailed away into open water, he could still hear the unsettling sounds coming from the newly filled tank, groaning, wailing, the protests of stressed steel. The tank was now filled to capacity for only the 8th time in its existence. It held 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 26 million pounds. The fresh shipment from the Caribbean was still warm, having been heated to reduce its viscosity for easier pumping. This warm molasses sat atop the older, colder molasses that had been in the tank through the frigid January weather. The temperature differential created expansion. The fermentation of sugar in the molasses generated carbon dioxide gas. Pressure built within the tank. The weather on January 15th broke unseasonably warm, climbing above 40 degrees Fahrenheit after days of temperatures near zero. The change put additional stress on the steel walls. January 15, 1919 began as a Wednesday like any other in the North End. Men left for work before dawn. Women prepared breakfast and sent children to school. Shopkeepers opened their doors. The rhythms of working-class life continued as they had for decades, unaware that this day would be different. The morning was unusually warm. After a week of bitter cold, temperatures that had dropped well below freezing, turning the harbor into a field of ice. The mercury was climbing toward the mid-40s. For the residents of the North End, this was a welcome relief. Children who had been cooped up inside could play outdoors. Workers who had been bundled in layers could loosen their coats. The warm air felt like a promise of spring, even though it was still deep winter. But the warm air was doing something else. It was expanding the molasses in the tank. The fresh shipment from Cuba, pumped in just 2 days earlier, was still warmer than the ambient temperature. Now the ambient temperature was rising. The molasses expanded. The steel, cold and brittle from weeks of winter weather, was being asked to contain more volume at higher pressure. Something had to give. At the Purity Distilling office on Commercial Street, workers went about their morning routines. Clerks filed paperwork. Managers reviewed shipment schedules. The guard on duty made his rounds, checking the fence, inspecting the locks, watching for suspicious activity. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. Inside the tank, invisible to everyone, cracks were propagating through the steel. The brittle metal, stressed beyond its capacity, was failing. Microscopic fractures that had been growing for 3 years were reaching critical length. The rivets, undersized and poorly installed, were straining against loads they were never designed to bear. The tank was minutes away from catastrophic failure, and no one knew it. At 12:30 p.m., workers at the paving yard broke for lunch. Some men stayed at their wagons, eating sandwiches their wives had packed. Others walked to nearby taverns for a hot meal and a beer. The day was warm enough that sitting outside was pleasant. Several teamsters gathered near their horses, feeding them oats, checking their shoes, making small talk about the weather. At the Engine 31 firehouse, the lunch shift had just finished. The men were cleaning up, putting dishes away, settling into the afternoon routine. Someone suggested a card game. George Leahy walked to the doorway, as he often did after lunch, to check the weather and watch the street. It was a habit, a small moment of peace in the middle of the day. In a few minutes, it would cost him his life. Across the street, Giuseppe Iantosca was at his window. He worked nights and should have been sleeping, but the warm weather had drawn him to the window to watch the street below. He could see his son Pasquale with the Di Stasio children, gathering wood scraps near the tank. He smiled. The boy was resourceful, always finding ways to contribute to the household. In a few years, he would be old enough for real work, for wages that could help support the family. Giuseppe had plans for his son, dreams that every immigrant father had. At 12:40 in the afternoon, the tank reached its limit. Bridget Claugherty, 65 years old, was in her house on Cops Hill Terrace, directly across from the tank. Her son Martin owned a saloon called the Pen and Pencil Club and had worked late the night before. He was still asleep upstairs. The Claugherty house had stood in the shadow of that tank since its construction. Bridget had heard it groan countless times. The Claughertys were one of the few Irish families remaining in the increasingly Italian North End. Martin's saloon catered to longshoremen and laborers, men who worked the waterfront and wanted a drink after their shifts. They had watched the molasses tank rise on the waterfront, had complained about the leaking and the smell, had grown accustomed to its looming presence outside their windows. Pasquale Iantosca, 10 years old, was collecting firewood with his friends Maria Di Stasio, also 10, and Maria's 8-year-old brother, Antonio. School was on lunch break. The warm weather had drawn children outside. The area near the tank was a good place to scavenge. The commercial district generated plenty of discarded wood scraps, and the molasses that leaked from the tank was an added bonus. Pasquale's father, Giuseppe, watched his son from the family's apartment window overlooking Commercial Street. Giuseppe was a laborer, one of thousands of Italian immigrants who had come to Boston seeking opportunity and found instead backbreaking work for meager wages. His son represented everything he hoped for, a child who would grow up American, who would have chances that Giuseppe himself had never had. At the Engine 31 firehouse, firefighters had just finished lunch. George Leahy, 38, was standing in the doorway. His colleagues Nat Bowering and Bill Connor were inside. The firehouse had been built specifically to serve this waterfront district, with its docks and warehouses and the constant risk of fire. The men of Engine 31 knew the neighborhood intimately. They knew the tank. They had watched it being built, had heard its groaning, had seen its leaking. George Leahy was a veteran firefighter, respected by his colleagues, known for his steady nerves in emergencies. In a few moments, he would become the first and the last Boston firefighter to die in a molasses flood. In the North End paving yard, dozens of city workers were loading and unloading wagons. Teamsters sat on their carts, waiting for loads. Blacksmiths worked at their forges, repairing equipment. Laborers hauled sand and gravel. It was the middle of a workday in a working neighborhood. William Brogan, 61, was one of those teamsters. Patrick Breen, 44, was a laborer at the paving yard. James Lennon, 64, another teamster. Peter Francis, 64, a blacksmith. These were working men in the last years of their careers, doing the physical labor that kept the city functioning. Eric Laird was only 17, a teamster just starting out. Ralph Martin was 21, a driver. Peter Shaughnessy was 18, another teamster. These were young men at the beginning of their working lives, still learning their trades, still imagining futures that stretched out before them. The first sound witnesses described was like rivets popping, a rapid-fire crack, crack, crack like a machine gun. Then a low, deep rumble that built into something like sustained thunder. The ground shook, horses reared, and then the tank simply opened. The initial rupture occurred near a manhole cover at the base, where stress concentrations were highest. Cracks propagated along the rivet lines with terrifying speed. The curved steel walls, no longer able to contain 26 million pounds of pressure, peeled apart and collapsed outward. The rivets that hadn't already failed became projectiles, embedding themselves in buildings and bouncing off brick walls with lethal force. What emerged was not a spill. It was an explosion. The molasses came out as a wave 25 feet high and 160 feet wide at its leading edge. It moved at 35 miles per hour, fast enough that outrunning it was impossible. Fast enough to generate destructive force comparable to a tsunami. The sheer density of molasses, 40% heavier than water, gave it devastating momentum. The physics of what happened in those first seconds would puzzle scientists for decades. Everything the public thought they knew about molasses, that it was slow, that it was gentle, that the old expression, slow as molasses in January, captured its essential nature, was wrong in the crucial moments after the tank ruptured. Molasses is what physicists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Its viscosity changes under stress. When subjected to rapid deformation, like exploding from a ruptured tank under enormous pressure, molasses behaves almost like a solid, maintaining its shape and transmitting force. The initial wave didn't splash or flow. It surged. Buildings didn't slowly fill with liquid. They were struck by a wall of matter moving faster than a human can sprint. The density of molasses, approximately 12 pounds per gallon, compared to about 8.3 pounds for water, meant that the wave carried tremendous momentum. A wave 25 feet high and 160 feet wide, traveling at 35 miles per hour, was essentially a moving wall of wet concrete. Nothing human-sized could resist it. The steel panels torn from the tank became missiles weighing hundreds of pounds. One section was driven against the supports of the Boston Elevated Railway, bending the steel girders and nearly tipping a passing streetcar off its tracks. The collision with the railway structure absorbed some of the wave's energy, likely preventing even greater destruction inland. The compression of air ahead of the moving molasses created additional destructive force. Witnesses reported being hit by a blast of air before the molasses itself reached them. Buildings on the edge of the flood zone had their windows blown out by the pressure wave, even before the sticky mass arrived. The Clawforty house on Copp's Hill Terrace was obliterated. The building was knocked off its foundation and collapsed before its occupants understood what was happening. Bridget Clawforty, the 65-year-old matriarch, was killed instantly, crushed by her own home as it disintegrated around her. Her son Stephen was buried in debris and would die 11 months later at the Boston State Hospital for the Insane, his mind destroyed by the trauma of the flood. Only Martin, who had been sleeping upstairs, survived, badly injured but alive. The Engine 31 firehouse, a solid brick structure built to withstand fire and weather, was picked up and moved off its foundation by the force of the wave. The second floor pancaked down onto the first. Firefighters Bill Connor later testified, "I looked out the window and saw a wall of molasses rolling like a wave at the seashore. I put my hand on the doorknob and the molasses surrounded the building, shut out the light, and the next thing I knew I came to under the building." Connor and Nat Bowering found themselves in an 18-inch crawl space, the floor above held up only by furniture. Molasses rose around them. "The flood of molasses at times flowed up to our ears," Connor recalled. "We bumped our heads on the floor above, trying to keep our noses and mouths above the fluid." George Lay was trapped by a billiard table that had collapsed onto him. He kept his head above the rising molasses for 2 hours as his fellow firefighters worked frantically to cut through the debris. They used acetylene torches. They sawed through beams. They could hear him, could see glimpses of him, could almost reach him. And then, exhausted, George Leahy's strength gave out. His head dropped into the molasses. He drowned within sight of the men trying to save him. Giuseppe Iantosca, watching from his apartment window, saw the exact moment his 10-year-old son Pasquale disappeared into the brown tide. He ran into the street. He searched for hours, wading through molasses that came up past his waist, digging through debris with his bare hands, calling his son's name into the chaos. Night fell. The temperature dropped. The molasses, which had moved so fast when warm, began to thicken as it cooled. Giuseppe kept searching. When he finally climbed the stairs to his apartment, empty-handed, his wife Maria was waiting. Her eyes were red from crying. Neither of them spoke. He had come home alone. That said everything. Pasquale's body was found the next day, struck by a railroad car that the wave had swept from the tracks. Maria Di Stasio, the girl who had been gathering firewood with him, had suffocated in the molasses. Her brother Antonio survived with a fractured skull, thrown against a lamppost by the force of the wave. Flaminio Gallerani, a 37-year-old driver, had been sitting on his truck near the tank when it ruptured. His body wasn't found until 11 days later. Cesare Nicolo, a 32-year-old expressman, wasn't discovered for 4 months. His body floated under a wharf near the Commercial Street freight station and only emerged when warmer weather returned to the harbor. In all, the dead ranged from 10 years old to 78. They were laborers and teamsters, blacksmiths and firefighters, mothers and children. 18 were men, 2 were children. 1 was an elderly woman. Most were Italian immigrants or Irish laborers, the working poor who lived and worked in the shadow of Purity Distilling's monument to corporate negligence. The injured numbered more than 150. Many had broken bones, fractured skulls, crushed organs. Others had nearly suffocated, pulled from the molasses with the syrup filling their mouths and noses and airways, and the molasses itself, having done its damage, began to change. January in Boston is cold. The unseasonably warm weather on the afternoon of the 15th gave way to freezing temperatures as evening approached. Cooling molasses from 10 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees increases its viscosity by a factor of 3. Cooling it further makes the increase exponential. The warm molasses from Cuba that had rushed through the streets at 35 miles per hour began to thicken and slow. What had been a flood became a bog. This was the cruel second phase of the disaster. The same properties that had made molasses so deadly as a fast-moving wave now made it deadly as a slow-moving trap. Victims who had survived the initial impact found themselves stuck in an increasingly viscous mass that resisted every effort to escape. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Rescue workers who arrived in the immediate aftermath could wade through waist-deep molasses, pulling survivors from the wreckage. But within hours, movement became nearly impossible. The molasses grabbed at boots and coats. People who stood still found themselves stuck to the ground. The cold air created a skin on the surface of the molasses that made it even harder to penetrate. First responders came from everywhere. 116 cadets from the USS Nantucket, a training ship of the Massachusetts Nautical School, docked at the nearby playground pier, were first on the scene. They had heard the explosion from their ship and ran toward the chaos. These young men, still in training to become merchant marine officers, worked for hours, pulling victims from the wreckage, maintaining order in the chaos, doing the grim work of separating the living from the dead. The cadets arrived to a scene that defied comprehension. Commercial Street had become an alien landscape, brown and sticky, and filled with the screams of the injured and the silence of the dead. Buildings had been knocked off their foundations. The elevated railway structure was twisted and precarious. Horses thrashed in the molasses, unable to escape, dying slowly as the syrup filled their airways. The cadets organized themselves into search teams, each taking a section of the disaster zone and working systematically through the debris. Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland, the officer in charge of the cadets, took command of the rescue operation until Boston authorities arrived. He divided his young sailors into groups, some to search for victims, some to maintain a perimeter and keep panicked family members from rushing into danger, some to begin the grim task of recovering bodies. The cadets worked with a discipline and courage that would be commended later by city officials. Many of them were teenagers themselves, not much older than some of the victims they pulled from the molasses. Boston police arrived next, their uniforms quickly coated in molasses as they waded into the disaster zone. Officers who had been directing traffic or walking beats across the city suddenly found themselves in the middle of an unprecedented catastrophe. There were no protocols for this, no training exercises that could have prepared them for the reality of people drowning in sugar. They did what they could, pulling victims from the sticky mass, organizing search grids, trying to bring order to chaos. Chief Peter McDonough received word of the event at 12:40 p.m., just minutes after the collapse. When informed of its severity, he sounded a third alarm, requesting additional personnel and rescue squads. Within half an hour, police officers from across the city were converging on Commercial Street. McDonough established a command post and began coordinating the various rescue efforts: police, fire, Navy cadets, civilian volunteers. The logistics were overwhelming. How do you search a disaster zone when you can barely move through it? How do you treat injured victims when you can't get ambulances to them? How do you recover bodies when you can't tell what's debris and what's human? Firefighters from across Boston responded, including the men of Engine 31 who had just lost one of their own. Despite their grief, despite the destruction of their own firehouse, they joined the rescue effort. The fire department brought equipment for cutting through debris, saws, axes, pry bars, and began the painstaking work of freeing victims trapped under collapsed buildings. But their usual tools were inadequate. Axes that could cut through burning wood bounced off hardened molasses, saws gummed up with syrup. Everything took longer, required more effort, frustrated men who were used to working efficiently in emergencies. Captain William L. Mitchell of Engine 7 organized teams to work under the collapsed elevated railway structure, where several victims were believed trapped. His men worked with ropes and pulleys, trying to lift twisted steel girders without causing further collapse. It was dangerous work. The structure was unstable, creaking and shifting with every movement, but people were dying underneath and the firefighters kept working. The Red Cross sent nurses who waded directly into the molasses to treat victims. These women showed extraordinary courage, working through the sticky mass, their uniforms ruined, treating wounds and providing comfort to the injured and dying. Nurse Minnie Cunningham, who had served in France during the war and thought she had seen the worst that humanity could inflict, later said that the molasses flood was more horrifying than anything she had witnessed in combat. At least in war, you expected death. Here, in the middle of a peaceful city on a Wednesday afternoon, death had arrived without warning and without mercy. The nurses established triage stations at the edges of the disaster zone, treating the injured as they were pulled from the molasses. Broken bones, crushed organs, suffocation, hypothermia. The range of injuries was overwhelming. Some victims were conscious and screaming. Others were silent, in shock, unable to process what had happened to them. The nurses worked through it all, bandaging wounds, administering morphine, holding the hands of people who were dying and knew it. They worked through the night. Acetylene torches and welders' tools were brought in to cut through wreckage and, when necessary, to melt the hardening molasses. The torches created their own hazards: sparks flying, hot metal, the risk of fire in a disaster zone already chaotic and dangerous. But without them, victims who might have been saved would certainly die. Firefighters using the torches worked in pairs, one cutting, one watching for new dangers. Both of them coated in molasses and exhausted but refusing to stop. Pickaxes and chisels became necessary to free debris as the molasses hardened. What had been liquid at 12:40 p.m. was approaching solid by midnight. Rescuers chipped away at the stuff like miners excavating rock. Every swing of a pickaxe risked striking something or someone underneath. The work required strength and delicacy in equal measure, and there was precious little of either left after hours of labor in freezing temperatures while coated in sticky syrup. Firefighters trying to wash the molasses away with fresh water from hydrants discovered it didn't work. The sticky syrup simply absorbed the water, creating an even more intractable mess. The molasses swelled, became more viscous, spread the contamination further. It was like trying to clean oil with water. The two didn't mix. They just created more problems. Someone finally realized that salt water from the harbor would cut through the molasses chemically, breaking down the sticky bonds that held everything together. The fireboat from Engine 31, the same station that had been destroyed, the same crew that had lost George Leahy, pumped millions of gallons of brine onto the streets. The salt water worked, dissolving the molasses, allowing it to flow into the sewers and eventually into the harbor. But it took hours, and by the time the streets were passable again, the chances of finding anyone alive had dropped to nearly zero. The harbor turned brown with molasses runoff and stayed that way until summer. Fish died by the thousands. The smell was overpowering, sweet and rotten at the same time, a sickening combination that clung to everything. The search for victims continued for 4 days before being called off. Bodies glazed in molasses were almost impossible to recognize. Some had to be identified by clothing or jewelry. Rescue workers had to wash the molasses from faces and airways before they could determine if a victim was alive or dead. Captain Craik of Engine 7 was working with his men under the elevated train tracks when he spotted something in the molasses, yellow hair floating on the surface. He plunged his arms into the sticky mass and pulled out the body of Maria Di Stasio, the 10-year-old girl who had been gathering firewood just moments before the tank collapsed. She had suffocated in the molasses, her lungs filled with the sweet substance that the children of the North End had once collected for treats. The cleanup would take 6 months. In the days following the disaster, USIA executives made a calculation. They had 2 options: admit that their tank was poorly built and accept responsibility for 21 deaths, or blame someone else. They chose blame. The anarchist theory emerged almost immediately. Newspapers reported that the tank had exploded, a word that implied bombing rather than structural failure. USIA's lawyers began constructing a narrative. Italian anarchists, angry at big business and American capitalism, had planted a bomb at the Commercial Street facility. Wasn't the tank guarded by police for exactly this reason? Hadn't there been threats? The company moved quickly to control the narrative. Within hours of the disaster, USIA representatives were talking to reporters, suggesting sabotage, emphasizing the company's security measures, pointing to recent anarchist activity across the country. They hired private investigators to interview witnesses, looking for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity near the tank. They offered rewards for information about anarchists who might have been involved. Arthur Gell, who had designed nothing and understood less, suddenly became an expert in explosion forensics. He told reporters that the violence of the tank's failure could only be explained by a bomb. He pointed to the twisted steel, the scattered debris, the speed with which the structure had come apart. These things, he insisted, were not consistent with simple structural failure. Never mind that he had no engineering background, no expertise in metallurgy or explosives, no qualifications whatsoever to make such determinations. He was the company man, and his job was to protect the company. USIA's insurance companies were equally motivated to prove sabotage. If the tank had been bombed, their policies didn't cover the damage. If it had simply failed due to poor construction, they were on the hook for millions in potential claims. Within days, insurance investigators were combing through the wreckage, looking for evidence of explosives, interviewing witnesses, building a case for sabotage that would absolve them of liability. Meanwhile, the families of the dead and injured were beginning to understand that they would have to fight for any compensation. USIA made no offer of voluntary settlement. There was no admission of fault, no expression of corporate regret, no acknowledgement that the company bore any responsibility for what had happened. If the victims wanted justice, they would have to sue for it. The first lawsuits were filed within weeks. Individual families sought damages for wrongful death. Property owners demanded compensation for destroyed buildings. The Boston Elevated Railway Company, whose structure had been damaged and whose operations had been disrupted, filed a massive claim. The city of Boston sued to recover the costs of cleanup and emergency response. By the summer of 1919, it was clear that these individual cases would need to be consolidated. The questions were the same. Was the tank properly designed? Was it properly built? Had USIA exercised due diligence in its construction and maintenance? The answers would determine liability for all the claims. On the advice of attorneys, the cases were combined into a single massive lawsuit that would become Doe v. United States Industrial Alcohol. The defense had several things going for it. Anarchist bombings were genuinely happening across America in this period. In April 1919, just 3 months after the Molasses flood, bombs were mailed to 36 prominent Americans, including John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. In June 1919, bombs exploded in 8 cities on the same night, including one that destroyed the front of Palmer's house in Washington, D.C. The anarchist threat was real, immediate, and terrifying to the American public. The North End's Italian population made it easy to connect immigrants with radicalism in the public imagination. And most importantly, USIA had money to hire experts who would testify to whatever theory the company needed. On the other side were 119 plaintiffs, victims, families of the dead, property owners, the city of Boston, and the Boston Elevated Railway Company, who had combined their lawsuits into a single massive legal action. It became known as DOR v. United States Industrial Alcohol, and it would be the largest class action lawsuit in Massachusetts history to that date. The Massachusetts Superior Court appointed an auditor to hear the case, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, a lawyer who had served as judge advocate for the 42nd Infantry Rainbow Division in France. The hearings began in August 1920 and would continue for nearly 5 years. The trial became a battle of experts, documents, and testimony, on a scale the American legal system had rarely seen. The plaintiffs were represented by attorney Damon Everett Hall, a meticulous lawyer who understood that defeating USIA would require overwhelming evidence. The defense was led by Charles Francis Choate, Jr., one of Boston's most prominent corporate attorneys who had the resources of one of America's largest corporations behind him. USIA's strategy was clear from the beginning: blame the anarchists. If the company could convince Colonel Ogden that the tank had been bombed, they would escape liability entirely. To support this theory, Choate assembled an army of expert witnesses. Metallurgists testified about the behavior of steel under explosive force. Chemists discussed the properties of various explosives. Engineers offered opinions about what kind of bomb would be necessary to rupture a tank of that size. The defense painted a vivid picture of anarchist conspiracy, playing on the fears that had gripped America since the wave of bombings in 1917 and 1918. The timing worked in USIA's favor. Just months after the hearings began, in September 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street, killing 38 people and injuring hundreds more. The Red Scare was at its peak. The climate of fear made the anarchist theory seem plausible, even obvious. But Damon Hall had the facts on his side. More than 920 witnesses took the stand. Over 1,500 exhibits were introduced. The transcript eventually ran to 25,000 pages. Hall's approach was methodical. He began by establishing the tank's history, its rushed construction, its inadequate testing, its years of leaking and groaning. Hall called Arthur Gell to testify, remotely, from a New York hotel, after Choate tried unsuccessfully to keep him off the stand entirely. Hall's questioning was devastating. Did Gell have any architectural or engineering experience? No. Did he know how to read blueprints? No. Did he have any training that enabled him to determine whether Hammond Iron Works was competent? No. Did any engineer inspect the steel when it was delivered? No. Did any architect or engineer ever inspect the completed tank? No. Hall then introduced testimony from MIT professor C.M. Spofford, who had examined pieces of the collapsed tank in his laboratory. The steel was thinner than specifications required. It was overstrained by the static pressure of the molasses. The plates had inadequate manganese content, making them brittle in cold weather. The rivet holes showed evidence of fatigue cracking. The tank had been failing slowly for years before it finally let go. Witnesses who had worked near the tank testified about the leaking, the groaning, the visible deterioration. Francis Brown described watching molasses flow down its sides repeatedly over the years. Isaac Gonzalez described finding steel flakes inside the tank and being ignored when he reported his concerns. USIA's defense relied primarily on the anarchist theory and experts who argued that only a bomb could explain the violence of the tank's failure. But Choate faced a fundamental problem. There was no physical evidence of a bomb, no explosive residue, no blast crater, no witnesses who saw or heard anything consistent with sabotage rather than structural collapse. Hall systematically demolished the bombing theory. He called explosives experts who testified that a bomb powerful enough to rupture the tank would have left unmistakable evidence. The tank had failed from the bottom up, starting at the manhole cover, where stress concentrations were highest, exactly as would be expected from structural failure. He called witnesses who had been near the tank when it collapsed. They heard no explosion, no sharp crack or boom that would indicate a detonation. They heard rivets popping, metal groaning, the sounds of steel failing under stress. The testimony dragged on month after month, year after year. Colonel Ogden, patient and methodical, listened to it all, and slowly over those 5 years, he formed his conclusions. On April 28, 1925, More than 6 years after 21 people drowned in Molasses on Commercial Street, Hugh W. Ogden submitted his report to the Massachusetts Superior Court. The finding was unambiguous. USIA was fully liable for the disaster. I believe and find that the high primary stresses, the low factor of safety, were responsible for the destruction of the tank, Ogden wrote. There was no evidence of sabotage. There was no bomb. There was only a tank built by a man who didn't know what he was doing, using steel that was too thin and too brittle, without proper testing or inspection, in deliberate disregard of warnings that the structure was dangerous. USIA had compromised safety to maximize production and minimize costs. The tank's location in a densely populated neighborhood showed no concern for the safety of the people who lived and worked nearby. Arthur Gell had been unable to read a blueprint or to determine specifications that would make the steel in the tank safe. Ogden ordered USIA to pay approximately $628,000 in damages, the equivalent of roughly $11 million today. Families of the dead received about $7,000 per victim. The settlement was real but inadequate. Many victims felt that no amount of money could compensate for what they had lost. But the verdict itself was perhaps more important than the dollars. For the first time, a major American corporation had been held financially responsible for wanton negligence that killed working people in a poor neighborhood. As historian Stephen Palaio would later write, Hugh Ogden's strong language and clear verdict against USIA in 1925 showed that the country had come a long way in 10 years. A corporation could be made to pay for wanton negligence of the sort that led to the construction, with virtually no oversight or testing, of a monstrous tank capable of holding 26 million pounds of molasses in a congested neighborhood. The immediate aftermath of the Ogden verdict rippled through American regulatory practice. Massachusetts and other states began passing laws requiring that engineers certify the safety of major construction projects. Building inspectors gained authority to examine industrial facilities. Architects were required to sign and seal plans. The Molasses flood became a case study in the emerging field of professional engineering ethics. The disaster demonstrated what could happen when unqualified individuals made technical decisions, when profit pressures overrode safety considerations, when workers' warnings were ignored. Engineering schools began teaching the case as an example of catastrophic failure caused by organizational dysfunction rather than simply technical error. Massachusetts enacted requirements that all structural plans be reviewed and stamped by licensed engineers. Building permits became mandatory for industrial structures that had previously been considered receptacles and thus exempt from oversight. Inspection procedures were standardized. The burden of proving safety shifted from the public, who had to demonstrate harm after the fact, to the companies, who now had to demonstrate compliance before construction could begin. These changes spread beyond Massachusetts. Other states enacted similar legislation. The federal government began developing industrial safety standards that would eventually evolve into OSHA regulations decades later. The Molasses flood was not the only driver of these changes. Workplace safety had been a concern since the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, but it contributed significantly to the momentum for reform. For the families of the victims, life went on, diminished, grieving, but continuing. Giuseppe and Maria Iantosca, who had lost their 10-year-old son Pasquale, received their portion of the settlement and tried to rebuild their lives in the North End. The money couldn't replace their son, but it allowed them to survive, to keep their apartment, to maintain some stability in a world that had become fundamentally unstable. Giuseppe never fully recovered from the trauma of that day. Friends and neighbors reported seeing him years later, standing at the window where he had watched his son disappear into the brown wave, staring out at the rebuilt street as if he might still catch a glimpse of Pasquale coming home with firewood. Maria threw herself into the church, attending Mass daily, lighting candles, praying for a son who was beyond prayer. They had other children, but Pasquale had been special, bright, curious, full of the potential that immigrant parents invested in their American-born children. His death broke something in both of them that never healed. The Di Stasio family, who had lost 10-year-old Maria and seen 8-year-old Antonio badly injured, faced their own long recovery. Antonio survived with a fractured skull and emotional scars that would never fully heal. He had nightmares for decades, dreams of brown waves, of his sister's face disappearing, of being unable to breathe. He grew up, married, had children of his own, but he never talked about that day. His children knew their aunt had died in the Molasses flood, but they learned the details from neighbors, not from their father. Some trauma is too deep for words. The Clofferty family saw their home destroyed and their lives shattered. Martin Clofferty eventually reopened his saloon, but the family was never the same. He had survived by chance, asleep upstairs while his mother died downstairs, while his brother Stephen suffered the injuries that would destroy his mind. Survivor's guilt is a particular kind of torment, and Martin carried it the rest of his life. Why had he lived when others died? Why had being asleep saved him when being awake killed his mother? There were no good answers. The funeral stretched over weeks. The Catholic churches of the North End, Sacred Heart, St. Leonard's, St. Stephen's, held service after service. The Italian community, which had been grieving young men lost to the war in Europe, now grieved children and fathers and mothers lost to corporate negligence at home. The Irish community buried their dead alongside them. In grief, at least, there was no prejudice. The Molasses had killed without regard to nationality or religion or language. Death was the great equalizer. The neighborhood itself recovered physically within months. The Molasses washed away, the debris cleared, new buildings rising where old ones had collapsed. The elevated railway was repaired. The paving yard returned to operation. To a casual observer by 1920, the North End might have seemed unchanged, but the emotional scars lasted generations. Survivors reported nightmares for the rest of their lives. Children who had played at the base of the tank grew up with survivors' guilt and trauma. Angelo Ciullo, who had been 7 years old and playing near the tank when it ruptured, had nightmares about drowning in molasses well into his 80s. He would wake up gasping, tasting sweetness, feeling the pressure on his chest. It never leaves you, he told a researcher in the 1980s. Even when you're awake, it's there. Families told stories of the flood to their children and grandchildren, keeping the memory alive even as the physical evidence disappeared. These weren't sanitized stories or heroic tales. They were warnings. This is what happens when rich men don't care about poor people's lives. This is what happens when profit matters more than safety. This is what happens when we let them build dangerous things in our neighborhoods, because we don't have the power to say no. The North End Italian community, which had already faced discrimination and prejudice, found itself blamed for the disaster by some quarters of Boston society. If anarchists had bombed the tank, as USIA claimed, then the anarchists must have been Italian radicals from the North End. Never mind that there was no evidence of a bomb. Never mind that the tank had been leaking and groaning for years. The narrative that suited USIA's defense also suited the prejudices of native-born Americans who wanted to believe that immigrants were dangerous, violent, and ungrateful. Some Italian families left the North End after the flood, seeking fresh starts in other neighborhoods where they wouldn't walk past the disaster site every day. But most stayed. This was their community. These were their churches, their shops, their friends and families. They had survived poverty in Italy and prejudice in America, and now they had survived a molasses flood. They would endure. The site of the tank became a maintenance yard for the Boston Elevated Railway, which eventually became the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. Today it's Langone Park, a city-owned recreational facility featuring baseball diamonds, playgrounds, and bocce courts. A small plaque at the entrance to the adjacent Popolo Park, placed by the Bostonian Society, is the only physical reminder. On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank at 529 Commercial Street exploded under pressure, killing 21 people. A 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks, crushed buildings, and inundated the neighborhood. Structural defects in the tank combined with unseasonably warm temperatures contributed to the disaster. Most people who walk past that plaque don't stop to read it. Most people who play in those parks don't know what happened there. The disaster has faded from living memory into history, from history into footnote, from footnote into curiosity. If you visit the North End today, you'll find one of Boston's most vibrant neighborhoods, famous for Italian restaurants and bakeries, historic walking tours, and summer festivals. The narrow streets that once ran with molasses now run with tourists photographing the Old North Church and the Paul Revere House. Local legend holds that on hot summer days, you can still smell molasses in the air, though whether this is chemically possible more than a century later, or simply the persistence of collective memory, remains debated. What happened to Arthur Gell? The historical record grows thin after the trial. He was never criminally charged. The legal system of 1919 did not typically prosecute corporate executives for industrial negligence that killed workers. The concept of corporate manslaughter was still decades away from widespread adoption. Gell received his promotion before the disaster, relocated to USIA headquarters in New York, and presumably continued his career in the alcohol industry through Prohibition and beyond. The flood did not end his career. The deaths of 21 people, the destruction of a neighborhood, the 6-year legal battle that exposed his incompetence and negligence, none of this prevented Arthur Gell from continuing to collect a salary, from advancing in his profession, from living out his life in relative comfort. This is perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the Molasses flood's aftermath. The settlement that USI paid, though substantial by 1925 standards, represented a fraction of the company's wartime profits. The regulatory changes that followed, though important, came too late for the 21 dead. The verdict that held the corporation liable did not hold any individual accountable. Arthur Gell walked away. In 2016, nearly a century after the disaster, a team of physicists at Harvard University decided to study the Molasses flood from a scientific perspective. The research team was led by Nicole Sharp, a fluid dynamics expert. Her team gathered data from 1919 newspaper articles, historical maps, weather reports, and contemporary accounts. They obtained samples of blackstrap molasses similar to what would have been stored in the tank. They built a scale model of the affected neighborhood. Their conclusions confirmed and elaborated what witnesses had described. The initial wave really did move at 35 miles per hour, fast enough to be unsurvivable. The molasses from the Caribbean, still warm when the tank ruptured, flowed rapidly through the streets. But as it cooled in the January air, its viscosity increased dramatically. I'm originally from Arkansas, where we have an old expression, slow as molasses in January, Sharp told the Boston Globe. Oddly enough, that's exactly what we're dealing with here, except that this molasses wasn't slow. The team's analysis revealed several key factors that contributed to the disaster's severity. The molasses had arrived from Puerto Rico just 2 days before the collapse. It was still warm, perhaps 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the ambient Boston air. This warmth reduced its viscosity, allowing it to flow freely when the tank ruptured. But as the molasses spread through the streets and absorbed heat from its surroundings, it cooled rapidly. The viscosity increased by a factor of 3 or more as the temperature dropped. This temperature effect explained one of the disaster's cruelest aspects, the transformation of the flood from deadly wave to deadly trap. Victims who survived the initial impact found themselves stuck in an increasingly viscous mass. Rescuers who could wade through the molasses in the first hour found movement nearly impossible by evening. The research also explained why so many victims suffocated rather than drowning in the traditional sense. Molasses is thick enough to block airways even without completely submerging a victim. People trapped in chest-deep molasses couldn't expand their lungs fully against the pressure of the liquid. They were essentially squeezed to death by the weight of the syrup around them. The Harvard study, presented at the 2016 meeting of the American Physical Society's Division of Fluid Dynamics, brought renewed attention to a disaster that had faded from public consciousness. News outlets around the world covered the research, often with headlines that emphasized the unusual nature of the event, but the coverage often missed the point. The molasses flood was not primarily a story about fluid dynamics. It was a story about corporate negligence, about the vulnerability of immigrant communities, about the absence of regulation, and the consequences of treating workers' lives as externalities to be managed rather than values to be protected. The physics made the disaster spectacular. The economics made it inevitable. The molasses flood belongs to a particular moment in American history, the transition between the freewheeling capitalism of the Gilded Age and the regulated economy of the 20th century. But the flood also belongs to no particular moment at all. It belongs to every era in which corporations cut corners on safety. It belongs to every community that discovers too late that someone else's profit was built on their risk. The tank had leaked for 3 years. Workers had reported problems. Management had responded by painting the steel brown. When the tank finally failed, the company blamed anarchists rather than admit its own negligence. These patterns repeat, generation after generation, industry after industry. In Boston's North End, Italian families gathered their dead and buried them. They accepted what compensation the courts allowed. They told their children stories about the day the molasses came. And slowly, decade by decade, the memory faded into folklore, into something almost funny, something almost unreal. George lay drowned in sugar while his fellow firefighters tried to save him. Pasquale Iantosca, 10 years old, died gathering firewood. Maria Di Stasio suffocated in the flood. Bridget Clougherty was killed in her own home. These were real people with real lives that ended on a Wednesday afternoon because a man with no engineering experience built a tank to meet a deadline. On January 15, 2019, the 100th anniversary of the disaster, a ceremony was held at Langone Park. Ground-penetrating radar had been used to locate the exact position of the tank's concrete foundation, still buried beneath the baseball diamonds and bocce courts. Officials read the names of the dead. Descendants of victims attended. The concrete base of Arthur Gell's tank is still there, somewhere under the playground. The molasses, of course, is long gone, washed into the harbor, absorbed into the earth, cleaned from every surface that once dripped with it. But the memory persists. And on hot summer days in the North End, some people still swear they can smell something sweet in the air. 21 people drowned in Molasses on January 15, 1919. It wasn't funny. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a series of choices, made by people who valued their deadlines and their profits more than the lives of the poor immigrants living in the shadow of their tank. Those choices killed children gathering firewood. They killed an old woman in her home. They killed a firefighter standing in his doorway. They killed teamsters and laborers and blacksmiths whose only crime was going to work on a Wednesday afternoon. The next time someone promises that regulation is the enemy of business, that safety requirements slow down progress, that companies can be trusted to police themselves, remember that Arthur Gell was promised a promotion if he finished on time. He finished on time. And 21 people paid the price.